The letter had promised £40 for the winter, and no questions about why the position stood empty. And Judith Colwell had told herself that a woman with a cottage 12 pounds from finished should not ask questions either. She had asked the postboy to wait, had climbed down into ankle-deep snow at the foot of the steps of Ashcombe Hall, and had lifted the brass knocker herself when no footman came. The door opened on a narrow width of candlelight, and a woman, perhaps 60 years old, keys at her belt, who looked at Judith's letter for exactly as long as it took to refuse it. "There is no engagement here," the housekeeper said. "You have been misdirected. This house receives no one." Judith had managed worse doors than this one. She said she had come at the Duke's own request, that the registry held his signature not 3 weeks past, that she had left a position and paid her own fare north on the strength of it. The housekeeper's face did not change. The door began to close on the strength of nothing at all. "Then I am sorry for your fare," the woman said, and shut it. Judith stood a moment in the settling snow, recalculating £12 against a coach fare she could not now recover, and picked up her case. She had walked perhaps 10 yards toward the gate, boots silent in the drifts, when the door opened again behind her, harder this time, and a man's voice crossed the white distance between them, not raised, but carrying. "Wait." She turned. He stood bareheaded in the doorway in his shirt sleeves, as though he had come down too fast to think of a coat, one hand out toward her, as if the 10 yards between them were a thing he might close simply by reaching. He introduced himself with a formality strange in a man standing coatless in snow, Julian Hargrove, Duke of Ashcombe, and said, before she could ask, that Mrs. Prewitt had exceeded any authority given her. He had signed the registry's letter himself 3 weeks past, and had in fact been waiting with some impatience since Tuesday for a Mrs. Colwell who had, by every account he'd been given, simply failed to arrive. It was now Thursday. Judith did not ask how a house managed to misplace a guest for 3 days under its own roof. There would be arithmetic enough to do later, without beginning it in a snowstorm. She followed him back up the steps instead, case still in hand, past a housekeeper who did not so much step aside as arrange herself to be nowhere Judith might have to pass close to. The hall inside was grander than any house Judith had kept books for and colder than most. 2 candles burned in a space built to hold 40 guests and their coats. Along the far wall, furniture stood shrouded under dust sheets, pale shapes like a room full of seated ghosts, and the single fire in a grate large enough to roast an ox gave off more smoke than heat. The Duke did not apologize for any of it, and something in Judith respected the omission. A man who apologized for his whole house on sight was usually a man performing humility rather than feeling it. He told her instead, plainly, that his daughter had stopped eating 9 days before, that the last governess had left in the night without troubling to explain why, and that he required someone who would not need 6 weeks to learn where anything in the house was kept before she could be of use. "I have never yet needed 6 weeks for anything," Judith said, setting down her case at last, and watched him decide, visibly, to believe her. Mrs. Prewitt, following them in with the keys still jangling at her belt, said only that supper had not been arranged for a third mouth, and that the blue room had not been aired since October, offered in the tone of a woman listing obstacles she expected to be found insurmountable. Judith said the still-room fire would air a room faster than most people believed if a body simply moved the mattress close enough to it, and that she had eaten worse than cold mutton on longer nights than this one. The Duke, watching this exchange with the particular attention of a man recalibrating something, said the blue room would do, and that wages would be as stated in the letter, and asked, almost as an afterthought, though Judith suspected it was not whether she required anything further before morning. She said only sleep, and he left her to find it, though it was some while yet before either of them did. Lying awake later, listening to a house too large and too empty to properly warm, Judith found herself doing the arithmetic she always did in a new place. How many months, how many wages, how soon she might reasonably leave without it counting as failure. £40 by March would carry her the last distance to Marrow Fen with room to spare. She told herself this twice, the way she always did, until it sounded less like a hope and more like a plan, and let herself sleep on the strength of it. The nursery, when Hollis showed her to it the next morning, was warmer than the hall only because someone had thought, at least, to keep coal there. Lucy Hargrove sat at a small table before a bowl of milk pudding gone cold and untouched, hair plaited by someone in too great a hurry to make the parting straight, and did not look up when the door opened. She was perhaps 8, thin in the particular way of a child who has stopped eating rather than a child who has never had enough, and there was a stillness about her that Judith recognized from other rooms, other losses, the stillness of someone who has decided that wanting things is a risk not presently worth taking. Judith did not crouch to the child's level, or pitch her voice bright and coaxing the way she had heard other women do, a register that seemed, in her experience, to frighten children further rather than less. She pulled out the second chair instead, sat, and ate a spoonful of the pudding herself, straight from the child's own bowl. "That wants more nutmeg," she said, to no one in particular, and ate a second spoonful before Lucy's eyes came up, outraged in a small, specific, entirely healthy way that had nothing whatever to do with grief. Judith knew the trick from further afield than a nursery. She had used it on sailors twice this child's age, men too seasick to eat until someone ate in front of them and made hunger look less like surrender and more like something ordinary, something a person might do without it meaning anything at all. Lucy did not smile, or speak, or forgive Judith the theft of her pudding in any way visible to an observer, but she took the bowl back, deliberately, and ate 4 spoonfuls before she set down the spoon again, and Judith counted that as a full day's wages earned before 9 o'clock in the morning, on her very first day in the house. "You may have the rest tomorrow, if you leave me any," Judith said, rising, and left before the child could decide whether that was a joke worth answering. Hollis, waiting in the corridor, said only that Miss Lucy had not spoken a full sentence to anyone but her father since All Souls, and that he had not expected pudding to be the thing that answered 9 days of silence. Judith said she had not expected it either, only that hunger, like grief, generally wanted something ordinary held out to it rather than something urgent. Her room over the old still room was smaller than the blue room Mrs. Prewitt had grudged her, but warmer, and Judith unpacked slowly that evening, the way she always did in a new house, laying each thing out in the particular order that let her feel, briefly, that she had chosen this arrangement, rather than been delivered into it by 3 years of narrowing necessity. 2 ledgers of her own, kept faithfully since Thomas died, proved to herself more than to any employer that she could be trusted with numbers larger than a household's weekly meat bill. A folding case of surgeon's instruments, most of them never once used by her own hand, kept because throwing them away had felt like an argument with an empty room that she had no wish to win. The deed to a cottage in Marrow Fen, not yet fully hers, wanting £12, and a signature in March to become so, and a letter from her sister Alice promising to have the garden turned over by the time the daffodils came up, as though a garden dug in expectation of Judith's arrival might somehow hasten it. She had learned, doing this work in 6 houses now, not to unpack everything. A woman who left her second-best gown folded in its trunk could tell herself, on the bad nights, that she had not fully arrived anywhere yet, and Judith had found this a comfort rather than a deprivation. Whatever Ashcombe Hall wanted of her, and it plainly wanted a great deal, judging by the state of the hall downstairs, she intended it to want no longer than the season promised. She had made that mistake once already, with a house in Hertfordshire that had asked for a fortnight and kept her the better part of a year, and she had promised herself, packing her case for the north, that she would not make it twice. The Duke found her in the estate office the following evening, where Hollis had directed her at his master's request to look over the household accounts because, he explained, standing in the doorway as though the room itself made him uneasy, a Duke oddly reluctant to enter his own study. His land agent had quit in October without notice, and Mrs. Prewitt's books had not balanced properly since summer, and there was no one else beneath his roof who could read a column of figures well enough to say with any confidence whether that mattered. Judith turned the pages for perhaps 20 minutes in silence, aware of him watching from the doorway, and plainly regretting having asked, the way people often regretted asking her things once they remembered that an honest answer might not be the one they wanted. The chandler's bill had crept upwards steadily since August, which might mean nothing more than the ordinary creep of prices in a hard winter. The butcher's bill troubled her more, not merely higher, but inconsistently so, spiking in months that bore no obvious relation to any occasion recorded in the house diary, then falling again, then spiking once more in a pattern too irregular to be honest waste and too regular to be pure accident. She said nothing of it yet. She had learned, in other houses, that an accusation offered on a first evening was rarely believed and always remembered afterward against the person who had made it, however true it later proved. Nothing here wants urgent mending, she said instead, which was true, strictly, without being the whole truth, and watched him decide to believe the first half of that sentence because he wanted, quite badly, to believe something good about his own house after 14 months of believing very little. "You'll tell me if that changes," he said. It was not quite a question. "I generally do," she said. "Eventually." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but something in the set of his mouth eased a fraction. The first sign she had yet seen that the man beneath the Duke had not entirely gone to ground. The stable boy fell from the hayloft 4 days later, on a morning when the snow lay too deep for any horse to reach the village doctor before nightfall, and it was Hollis who came running for Judith rather than for anyone else in the house. A fact that told her, more clearly than any wages could have, how quickly a household learns whom to trust with the things that frighten it. She found the boy, Sam, white-faced and cradling his wrist in the straw, and set to work without ceremony. Thomas's old instruments unrolled on a clean cloth, her sleeves pushed back, a running commentary pitched low and steady that kept the boy talking about his sister's wedding instead of screaming about his wrist, because a person who is talking, she had learned aboard ship, generally cannot scream at the same time. The Duke arrived in the stable doorway partway through, coatless again, as though cold simply failed to register with him whenever something more urgent presented itself. Judith did not stop to explain herself or wait for permission. She asked him to hold the lamp steady and angled just so, and he did it without a single question. A Duke holding a lamp for a woman he had known 5 days while she set a stable boy's wrist with her dead husband's instruments, and that unhesitating obedience was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had thought to ask aloud yet. Afterward, in the tack room, washing her hands in a basin gone faintly pink, she told him plainly that his road to the village doctor was likely to stay closed another week at least, and that she had set worse brakes than Sam's aboard ship, on men with considerably less patience than a frightened 12-year-old. "Whose ship?" he asked. Not idle curiosity. Something more careful than that. She told him about Thomas, briefly, a purser's clerk who had taught himself surgery from necessity on long crossings, and had nothing better to occupy a wife with too much sea and too little conversation than teaching her what he knew alongside him. She did not tell him the rest of it, that the same lungs which had carried Thomas through a dozen Atlantic crossings had finally failed him on dry land, in a bed she had chosen herself for its good light, while she sat holding a hand that no longer needed setting, because there was nothing left in her whole competent body of knowledge that could fix a man from the inside, that she kept folded small, the way she kept most things that still had the power to undo her if handled carelessly. The Duke did not press her for more than she offered. He only said quietly that Sam's wrist would mend cleaner for having been set by someone who had done it before out of necessity rather than training, and Judith understood this, correctly, as the closest thing to gratitude the man currently had available to him. They fell, without either of them quite arranging it, into the habit of the estate office after Lucy's supper, Judith with the household books spread before her, the Duke ostensibly reading correspondence he rarely finished, both of them working past the hour when either had good reason to still be awake, the fire burning low, and neither troubling to build it back up, because doing so would have meant acknowledging how late it had grown. It was over a stack of unpaid tradesmen's letters in the second week of December that he told her about Cecilia. Not the whole of it, not yet, but enough to be going on with. He had been in London, he said, settling a mortgage that could not wait, when the fever took hold. The local doctor had bled her, as doctors did, twice in one day, and it had not answered, and by the time his carriage reached Ashcombe the house was already dressed in the black crepe. Someone else had ordered, because no one had thought to wait for him to choose it himself. He said all of this in the flat, careful voice of a man reciting a fact he had made himself memorize precisely so that it could never again surprise him by arriving unrehearsed. "I have not left this house in 14 months, he said, "not for a single night." Judith did not tell him, though she recognized it plainly enough, that this was not devotion but a kind of hiding dressed carefully in the clothes of duty. She had done something close enough to the same thing herself, in her own smaller rooms, for 3 years running. She asked instead, with the particular bluntness of someone who had nursed enough dying men to have lost her patience for delicacy, exactly what the doctor had bled her for, and how much, and on what evidence he had judged it necessary. Practical questions, unsentimental ones, the kind no one in this house had apparently thought to ask him in 14 months of careful, useless sympathy. He answered every one of them, and somewhere in the answering, his shoulders came down half an inch from where they had been sitting since the day she'd arrived, and Judith understood that she had just given him, without quite meaning to, the first genuinely useful thing anyone had offered him since his wife's funeral. Not comfort, which he plainly could not yet use, but information, treated as information, by someone who was not afraid of it. "You did nothing wrong," she said finally, because it was true, and because he had clearly never once let himself hear it. Fever that fast answers to nothing, in London or out of it. You were not absent from a thing you could have prevented by being present. He did not thank her for it, but he looked at her for a long moment across the low fire, in a way that had nothing to do with household accounts, and said only, "You say that as though you have had cause to work it out for yourself." "I have," Judith said, and did not elaborate, and he did not ask her to. Alone afterward, the Duke sat some while longer at the desk than the letters in front of him strictly required, turning over the plain, unsentimental way she had asked her questions, the way she had made room for an answer without once flinching from it. He had spent 14 months surrounded by people who treated his grief as a thing to be managed around, spoken of in lowered voices if spoken of at all, and had not realized, until this evening, how much that careful softness had come to feel like being handled rather than known. He did not yet have a name for what he felt watching her gather the ledgers to leave the room. He suspected, uneasily, that he would need one before the winter was out. By the third week of December, the pattern in the butcher's bills had a shape Judith no longer trusted to coincidence. Spikes that lined up on a careful second pass through 8 months of accounts with quarter days, which were also, Hollis mentioned once in passing without seeming to grasp the weight of what he'd said. The days on which Mrs. Prewitt's nephew Simon generally rode over from Buxton to visit his aunt. Judith wrote nothing down yet. She had been wrong about houses before, in ways that had cost her a position and a reference both. And this house had already taught her that its silences carried more freight than its noise. Mrs. Prewitt, for her own part, had taken in the meantime to leaving Judith's morning coal unlit and Judith's letters unforwarded a day or two beyond any reasonable excuse, small enough unkindnesses that complaining of them would have made Judith sound petty rather than accurate, which she suspected was precisely their design. She did not complain. She built her patience the way she built a hem, in small, even, nearly invisible stitches on the theory, proven correct more often than not, in her experience, that a seam sewn slowly generally held weight better than one rushed. She said nothing of any of it to the Duke, not yet. A suspicion offered without proof was a debt she was not prepared to ask him to pay on her word alone, not against a housekeeper of 20 years' standing, however unlit her coal grate had lately been. The widow Corrigan's cottage, half a mile past the home farm, had wanted a new section of roof since Michaelmas, a fact Judith learned only because the old woman herself stopped Judith on the lane to ask, with the careful, non-accusing courtesy of a tenant who has learned not to expect much, whether the new person doing the books might know when the promised thatcher was likely to come. Judith did not know. She went to look at the roof herself that same afternoon, found a hole in it wide enough to admit snow onto the widow's own bed, and returned to the estate office with mud on her hem and a specific figure in her head. £4, 10 shillings, the sum the account book showed as paid to a thatcher back in November for work that had plainly never been done. She brought it to the Duke directly this time, without softening it, because a leaking roof over an old woman's bed in a Derbyshire winter was not a suspicion she could afford to keep folded small until she had better proof of everything else. He went to see it himself within the hour, on foot, in the snow, and stood in the widow's kitchen, listening to her thank him with a gratitude that plainly embarrassed him more than any accusation could have, because it made visible exactly how long he had let such things go unlooked at. £4, 10 shillings exactly, he said afterward, walking back through the snow in silence for a long moment first, for work that was never begun at all. For work that was never begun, Judith agreed, and paid out on the same week, as it happens, that your housekeeper's nephew settled a debt in Buxton I've no proof he owed. Only a neighbour's gossip that he did. Duke said nothing for the length of the lane, but he ordered the thatcher sent for that same day, from his own purse rather than the household account, and told Hollis, within Judith's hearing, that every roof on the estate was to be walked and reported on before the month was out. The first order he had given regarding the tenantry, Hollis said later, quietly, since before the Duchess died. On the shortest day of the year, the Duke asked her, in the estate office after Lucy had gone up to bed, to take the household accounts under her own name outright, not as Mrs. Prewitt's assistant, a role Judith had never formally held but had somehow drifted into regardless, but as the person whose signature the tradesmen of Hollowmere would come to know and trust. Her wages, he said, would double from the new year, and her position would be called whatever she wished it called, so long as the tradesmen believe it and Prewitt understands it. Judith understood the offer for what it was, more than a raise. A wager, the Duke placing more of the house's daily truth into her hands than into anyone else's, including, in practical terms, his own. She accepted it, and said nothing yet of the Thatcher's £4.10 or the pattern in the butcher's bills that pointed at more than one dishonest tradesman wanting proof rather than pattern before the accusation cost a woman of 20 years' service her place on suspicion. Judith could not yet fully set down on paper. She began, from that evening, keeping her own separate accounting of every discrepancy she found, in a small private hand, in the second of her 2 ledgers, the one she had kept, until now, for nothing but her own peace of mind. Mrs. Prewitt received the news, when it reached her the following morning, with a stillness that told Judith more than any outburst could have. She said only that she was glad of the help, in a voice entirely without gladness in it, and asked, with apparent idleness, whether Mrs. Colwell intended to go back through the old accounts as well as the new or only forward from Christmas. It was, Judith understood at once, not idle at all. She said she generally went back as far as a discrepancy led her, and watched something close and careful settle behind Mrs. Prewitt's eyes, like a door being quietly checked to see that it was locked. The tallow chandler came to the kitchen door himself on the 2nd of January, refusing to leave another delivery, until £11 outstanding since October were settled, and it was Judith who went down to speak with him rather than send Hollis, with excuses she did not have and would not manufacture. She did not deny the debt or ask for patience as a favour. She opened her ledger on the kitchen table in front of him, showed him the dates, and offered £4 that morning against the whole, with the balance cleared by quarter day, in a hand and a tone that made plain she considered the debt a fact to be managed rather than a shame to be talked around. The chandler, who had expected apology and got arithmetic instead, took the £4 and left his cart unloaded, but his temper considerably improved, and told the baker in the village within the week that Ashcombe Hall had got itself a woman who paid what she owed, and said so plainly, which did the house's credit rather more good than a dozen apologetic letters would have managed. The Duke, hearing of it from Hollis rather than from Judith herself, who had not thought the matter worth reporting, said only that he had spent 14 months assuming every knock at the kitchen door was a problem requiring his own presence to solve, and had apparently been wrong about that too. Lady Augusta Melrose arrived 3 days before Christmas in a carriage that announced itself from the far end of the drive, all jangling harness, and a coachman clearly instructed to make an entrance, and took approximately 4 minutes inside the front hall to establish that she considered Judith an interloper of uncertain and probably mercenary purpose. She asked Judith's age outright, over sherry, before either of them had removed their gloves. She asked her late husband's profession, the precise terms of her wages, and whether she had any relations who might have arranged this position to some advantage, each question delivered with the pleasant, merciless directness of a woman who had spent 30 years asking impertinent things and calling it concern for her family. Judith answered every one of them without flinching, having anticipated most of the substance, if not the exact order, until Lady Augusta ran out of ways to ask, without quite asking, whether Judith was angling for her brother's title, and settled instead, over the soup course, into simply watching her, a silence Judith found considerably more unsettling than the questions had been. It was Lucy, in the end, who undid the last of Lady Augusta's suspicion without meaning to trouble herself over any of it. Halfway through the fish course the child announced, apropos of nothing, that Mrs. Colwell had taught her that morning how to splice a rope's end properly, over and under, and that it was very much harder than it looked, and that Papa had tried it too, and got it wrong twice. It was a skill of no conceivable use to a duke's daughter, and precisely the sort of small, specific, entirely unguarded fact an aunt could not resist repeating for the remainder of her visit, and Judith watched something in Lady Augusta's face shift, not into approval, not yet, but into the beginning of a question mark where a period had been. "You are not at all what I expected," Lady Augusta said to her later, alone with the particular bluntness of a woman who considered honesty a kindness rather than a risk. "I confess I do not yet know what you are instead." "Neither, quite, do I," Judith said, which was truer than she had meant it to be, and Lady Augusta laughed, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and said that was, in her experience, generally the answer of someone worth knowing further. She found the walled garden on Boxing Day morning, its iron gate half buried in a drift that had clearly not been disturbed since the last frost, and spent the better part of an hour clearing a path toward a sundial at its center that told no useful time in December, but had plainly mattered to someone once, judging by the care in its carving. Duke found her there some while later, hands raw and reddened with the cold despite her gloves, and instead of asking why she had chosen to spend her half-day off shoveling snow, or ordering her back inside to the fire, he picked up the second spade leaning forgotten against the wall and began clearing from the opposite end without a word of explanation offered or asked for. They met in the middle nearly an hour later, breath clouding between them, the sundial finally visible again down to its base. He told her, studying his own reddened hands rather than her face in the particular way she had noticed he did whenever a fact cost him something to say aloud, that Cecilia had planted the roses along the east wall herself the spring before she died, kneeling in the dirt in a gown far too fine for the work, and laughing at him when he told her so. No one had touched the garden since, he said, because touching it had felt too much like admitting the roses would need someone now that she could not be the one to prune them. Roses want pruning whether or not anyone feels ready to think about it, Judith said, which was true of gardens, and she suspected true of grief besides, though she did not say that second part aloud. He made a sound at that which was not quite a laugh, but was closer to one than anything she had yet heard from him. A short exhale through the nose, involuntary, the corner of his mouth catching before he seemed to remember himself and let it go. It was, she thought, walking back with him toward the house in the last grey light of the afternoon, a beginning of something, though she was careful, that evening, not to let herself decide of what. She noticed, all the same, that she had stopped counting the days until March quite so deliberately as she had when she first unpacked her case, and found she did not much mind the lapse. The neighborhood assembly at the Hollowmere Assembly Rooms on the 4th of January was the first the Duke had attended in 14 months, a fact remarked upon by nearly every guest within Judith's hearing before the first set had even formed, and Lady Augusta ensured that Judith attended it too. In a gown of her own ladyship's, let out generously at the seams, and let down at the hem, delivered to Judith's room that morning with the flat instruction that a woman managing a duke's entire household had no business appearing to manage nothing else. Judith danced twice, both times with elderly gentlemen of the district keen to discuss crop rotation and the price of wool, and was watching the fire rather than the floor, her second partner having wandered off toward the card-room mid-conversation, when the Duke crossed the whole length of the room and came to stand simply beside her, without asking her to dance, without announcing his purpose at all. They did not dance. He asked her instead, quietly, under the noise of the fiddle striking up a new set, whether she thought the garden roses might survive being moved nearer the nursery window, so that Lucy could watch them from her bed once summer came. Judith understood this for the confession it plainly was. A man asking permission, in the roundabout language of horticulture, to plan a summer he had not, until very recently, believed himself capable of wanting to see. She said the roses would mind the move less than he thought, if it were done properly, in good soil, with patience. He said he had heard that patience was not, on the whole, his strongest quality, and Judith said she had noticed nothing yet to contradict him, and he laughed then. Properly. This time, a full, unguarded sound that turned two heads across the room, and that he seemed almost startled to have produced. Behind them, Judith was aware of the room's attention shifting by careful degrees, not toward scandal yet, but toward a kind of recalculation, several matrons of the district revising, almost visibly, whatever account of the new Ashcombe housekeeper they had carried into the room with them. Mrs. Fenshaw of the home farm, who had called Judith the Duke's temporary woman over tea only a fortnight before, was heard to remark to her neighbor, watching the Duke laugh in a corner of a ballroom he had not properly entered in over a year, that Mrs. Colwell seemed to have a steadying effect on his grace that no physician in the county had yet managed. Walking back from the coach-house after the last of the guests had gone, the cold clear enough to hurt in the lungs, he asked her plainly why a woman of her particular competence had spent 3 years doing temporary work in other people's houses rather than something steadier. A fair question, and one she could have answered with the version she gave everyone: the cottage, the savings, the tidy arithmetic of a plan nearly finished, and it would have been true without being honest. Instead, she told him about the last month of Thomas's illness, how she had set bones and stitched wounds, and, on one bad Atlantic crossing, taken a sailor's crushed arm off at the elbow with her own 2 hands and a bottle of rum, and saved his life doing it, and had then sat beside her own husband in the end, able to do nothing at all but hold a hand that no longer needed setting, because there was nothing left in the whole of her hard-won competence that could fix a man failing from the inside. She had decided, somewhere in that room, watching a fire she'd built herself burn down to nothing, that arrangements which ended on a fixed date were a great deal safer than ones a person allowed herself to need. He did not offer her comfort, for which she found herself grateful. Comfort, offered too quickly, had always felt to her like being handed a blanket before anyone had asked whether she was cold. He said only that he understood exactly that particular arithmetic, having done the sum himself for 14 months running, and reached briefly, in the dark, for her hand, not holding it, not quite, only finding it, the way a careful man checks that a door is where he left it before he trusts his weight against it. "I am not accustomed," Judith said, "to arrangements that don't end." "Neither," he said, "am I, lately. Perhaps we might practice being bad at it together." She did not answer that directly, but she did not take her hand back either, and they walked the rest of the way to the house in a silence that felt, for the first time since her arrival, like something other than a truce. Lucy noticed before anyone troubled to tell her anything, the way children generally do. She took to appearing in the estate office doorway some evenings now instead of waiting to be fetched, curling into the window seat with a book she rarely read, simply to be in the room while the 2 adults worked, and neither Judith nor the Duke saw any reason to send her back upstairs. It was, Judith thought, watching the child fall asleep against the cold glass more evenings than not, the nearest thing to a family the 3 of them had yet managed to build without any of them quite deciding to build it on purpose. The garnet pendant went missing from Lucy's keepsake box on the 9th of January. The single piece of her mother's jewelry set aside expressly for the child, small and unremarkable except in what it meant, and it was Mrs. Prewitt who discovered the loss and Mrs. Prewitt who mentioned, in the very same breath as the discovery, that Mrs. Colwell had been alone in the nursery wing the previous afternoon settling accounts for the linen cupboard, a fact both entirely true and entirely beside the point, offered with the particular gentleness of a woman careful to be seen regretting what she was, at the same moment ensuring everyone heard. By supper time the word theft had passed through the servants' hall without anyone quite remembering afterward who had spoken it first. By the time it reached the Duke, it arrived dressed carefully as concern rather than accusation, which made it, Judith would think later, very much harder to refuse. Judith heard of it herself only second-hand, from Hollis, whose face when he told her had the particular carefulness of a man delivering news he wished were not his to deliver. She said flatly that she had not touched the pendant, had in fact barely known where it was kept, and Hollis said he had never for one moment supposed otherwise, which was kind of him, and did nothing at all to change what was now being said 2 floors below them. He did not accuse her outright. She would give him that later, when she was able to give him anything at all. He was incapable, she thought, of that particular cruelty. But he came to her that evening with a carefulness in his manner that was, in its own way, its own kind of answer, and asked whether she would object to her room being looked through, so that the matter might be settled properly and no shadow left hanging over her name. It was the word settled that undid her more than the request itself, as though her innocence were an account awaiting reconciliation rather than a fact already simply true. She said he might look wherever he wished, in a voice she kept perfectly level, and did not tell him what it cost her to say it so evenly, or that she had heard this exact careful tone before in other houses, always from people who called themselves fair, while making very certain never to simply ask. "You could ask me instead," she said once, before she let the subject drop entirely, "whether I took it." "I am asking," he said, and she understood, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, that he meant the search itself as the asking, that some old, careful part of him no longer trusted a plain answer to be enough, not even hers, not after 14 months of learning the hard way that the people closest to him could fail him without meaning to. She packed the case herself that same night, methodically, ledgers and surgeon's instruments and folded deed returned to the exact order in which she had unpacked them a month before, because a woman who has done this often enough learns to leave a room precisely as tidily as she found it. She did not cry. She had noticed, across 3 years of arrangements that ended, that crying was reserved for the things a person still hoped to keep, and she had stopped, somewhere on the dark walk back from the coach house a week before, letting herself believe this arrangement might be different from the others. Hollis found her in the corridor with the case already in her hand and said nothing at all, which she understood, correctly, as the kindest thing currently available to him to offer, she thought, standing at the top of the stairs with the case handle cold through her glove, of the letter that had brought her here. £40, no questions asked, and reflected that she had, in the end, asked several questions after all, and had gotten answers to most of them, and that the last one, apparently, was simply this: that a house could want a person's competence a great deal more than it wanted the person attached to it. It was Lucy who stopped her at the top of the stairs, barefoot on the cold boards, having climbed out of bed and down 2 flights, rather than lose the only person in the house who had ever eaten pudding with her before once asking why she wouldn't. She said, in the plain, unpracticed voice of a child who has decided a thing matters more than her own fear of saying it, that she had seen Mrs. Prewitt 2 nights before, in the blue parlor, at the hollow base of the tall brass candle stand by the window, doing something with her hands that Lucy had not understood at the time, and had thought nothing more of, until the pendant was spoken of at supper, and she had understood, all at once, exactly what she had seen. "I didn't tell anyone," Lucy said, "because nobody asked me what I saw. They only asked how I felt about Mama's things going missing. And that isn't the same question at all." It was, Judith thought, precisely the distinction she herself had spent the whole visit trying to teach the child without ever once saying so aloud, and hearing it handed back to her now, at the worst possible moment, nearly undid the composure she had spent all evening carefully constructing. Hollis arrived behind Lucy a moment later with a lamp and an expression Judith had not seen on his face before. Something between shame and resolve, he said quietly, that he had for reasons he was ashamed to explain sooner kept his own private copies of the household accounts these 18 months past, a butler's old habit of caution he had never troubled to break, and that the dates against which every unexplained figure fell matched, almost precisely, to the day, Simon Prewitt's visits to his aunt. Judith set down the case she had not yet managed to carry past the second stair. "Well," she said to Lucy, to Hollis, to the cold corridor generally, in a voice that had regained, somewhere in the last minute, every bit of its usual steadiness. "Then I believe we had better go and ask someone the right question." The Duke summoned Mrs. Prewitt to the estate office within the hour, Lady Augusta and Hollis present as witnesses at Judith's quiet insistence, and laid the 2 accounts side by side across the desk between them. Judith's own careful reconstruction of 8 months' discrepancies, and Hollis's 18 months of patient private copying, the figures in both agreeing with one another closely enough to leave very little room remaining for argument. Mrs. Prewitt did not deny it for long. Simon owed £40 to a moneylender in Buxton, who had, in recent weeks, stopped accepting further promises, she said, her voice steady even as her hands were not, and she had told herself each time that it would be the last time, that she would find some other way before it came to this. She had hidden the pendant in a moment of pure panic, she said, understanding suddenly that the ledgers were about to be read by someone who actually knew how to read them properly, meaning all along to return it once the immediate danger had passed, before anyone was the wiser. The Duke asked Judith, before he pronounced any judgment of his own, what she believed ought to be done. A question that was itself, Judith understood, a kind of repair already beginning. A man who had ordered her own room searched without troubling to ask her opinion first, now asking that same opinion on the ruin of a woman who had served his house for 20 years. Judith considered it carefully. Prison, she said at last, would answer nothing and satisfy only anger, and anger was a poor foundation for anything a household needed to stand on afterward. Better a dismissal without character reference for the theft specifically, the debt repaid in full from wages already owed her, a small pension besides drawn from what remained, and a letter written to Mrs. Prewitt's sister in Buxton, asking plainly whether she might be taken in. It was not forgiveness, precisely. It was proportion, which Judith had come to believe, across 3 years of watching other people's cruelty and other people's mercy both fail equally to mend anything permanently, mattered rather more than either extreme on its own. Mrs. Prewitt, hearing the terms, said nothing for a long moment, and then said only, to Judith directly, that she had not expected mercy from the woman she had tried hardest to ruin, and Judith said that mercy had very little to do with expectation, and rather more to do with what a household needed to be able to live with afterward. The Duke spoke last, before Mrs. Prewitt was shown out to gather her things. He said that a housekeeper's dishonesty over 8 months was a serious matter and would be treated as one, but that a master who had not looked properly at his own accounts in 14 months bore no small share of the blame for how far it had been allowed to run, and that he intended, going forward, to look a great deal more carefully at everything under his own roof, not only the ledgers. Mrs. Prewitt, gathering what dignity remained to her, said that was more honesty than most masters troubled themselves to offer a departing servant, and left the room without further argument. Found her at the gate an hour later, case still in her hand exactly as it had been the night she first arrived. And this time he did not call out to her across a distance. He crossed the whole length of the drive himself, coatless again, as though he had still not learned, in a month and a half, to dress for weather he plainly meant to walk out into whenever she was the reason for going. He said he was sorry, and meant it fully. She could hear that much in his voice, but he did not stop at sorry. He told her the searched room would never happen again, in any house where he held authority, to her or to anyone else beneath his roof, and that he had already sat down and written, before he came to find her, a letter to the registry correcting whatever account of tonight's events they might otherwise be given. And he told her this last more carefully than the rest, as though he had turned the words over some while before trusting himself to say them, that he intended, if she would permit it, to travel with her to Marrow Fen himself before March, to see with his own eyes the cottage she had come twice now, to the edge of giving up on his account, because a man had no business asking a woman to want his house until he had troubled himself properly to understand exactly what it was she stood to lose in choosing it. Judith set the case down in the snow between them. She told him she did not wish to be tested twice over for the same fault, that trust extended once, and then quietly withdrawn again at the very first difficulty was not, in her considered experience, trust at all, and that whatever she agreed to now would have to include the household accounts remaining hers in genuine fact as well as in name. Not a wife decorating a house in which she had no real say, but a woman with work she had earned outright the right to keep doing, for as long as she wished to do it. He said yes to every clause of it, without attempting to negotiate down a single word, and that unhesitating agreement told her, in the end, rather more than the apology itself had managed to. "I believe," Judith said, "I could manage an arrangement that does not end, if you are in earnest about offering one." "I am," he said, entirely in earnest, and something in his voice, careful and unguarded at once, told her this was true in a way the assembly-room laughter, and the garden, and the held hand in the dark had all, separately, been building toward without either of them quite naming it until now. He kissed her there at the gate, in the last grey light of the afternoon, briefly, and without any of the performance she had half expected of a duke, more like a man confirming, with evident relief, a fact he had strongly suspected for some weeks, and was glad, finally, to have proven correct beyond any further doubt. Lucy, watching from the nursery window with the particular shamelessness of an 8-year-old who has decided the outcome concerns her directly, would later claim to have seen the entire thing, and neither adult found it in themselves to mind especially that she had. They walked back up the drive together afterward, case retrieved and carried this time in his hand rather than hers, past the very door where a housekeeper had once told her there was no engagement here, and Judith noted, without any great ceremony, that the door stood open now, unattended, light spilling out across the snow in a way it had not on the night she'd first arrived to find it firmly shut against her. By April, the walled garden's roses had been moved beneath the nursery window exactly as promised, still bare-branched but budding, and Lucy, who called her Judy now, with the particular carelessness of a child who has stopped bothering to count how many people she is permitted to love at once, took to sitting on the windowsill most mornings before lessons, watching for the first colour to show. The household books balanced within a shilling most quarters, kept in a firm, unhurried hand that the tradesmen of Hollowmere had come to know on sight, and, more usefully, to trust, signed simply Judith Hargrove, a title of Duchess attached to the name in every legal document that required it, and worn by the woman herself the way she wore most things she had earned, competently, and without any great ceremony about it. Alice had taken the cottage at Marrow Fen after all, rent-free and glad of the arrangement, the garden she had dug in hopeful anticipation of her sister's arrival now given over instead to Alice's own children, which struck Judith, when she thought of it, as a considerably better use for it than the quiet, solitary life she had once planned to live there alone. The deed itself sat now inside the old surgeon's case, on a shelf in a room that was fully and permanently her own at last, unpacked and never repacked, tucked in beside instruments she still used from time to time on tenants' children when the roads were bad and the Hollowmere doctor slow to come. Thomas's tools still earning their keep in a life he could never have quite imagined for her, and that she thought, on her better days, he would nonetheless have approved of. Mrs. Prewitt wrote once from Buxton, in February, a short, formal letter enclosing the first installment of a debt she was repaying in careful, regular sums, and Judith answered it, and did not mention the letter again to anyone in the house, considering the matter, on the whole, properly closed. The wedding itself, in March, was a small affair by the standards of a duke's household. The vicar of Hollowmere, Lady Augusta pronouncing herself satisfied at last, Hollis weeping without any pretense of doing otherwise, and Lucy insisting on carrying the garnet pendant, restored now to its rightful box, pinned instead to a ribbon at Judith's wrist for the occasion, because a wedding, she informed everyone gravely, was exactly the sort of day her mother would have wanted the pendant to see. Judith wore green, not white, having pointed out with characteristic practicality that a woman of 40 marrying for the second time had no particular need to pretend otherwise, and the Duke had agreed with a promptness that made Lady Augusta laugh into her handkerchief for the better part of an hour. The front door of Ashcombe Hall stood open most spring mornings now, to let the garden's new air into rooms that had gone too long without it, and if a woman crossing the drive with her case still sometimes glanced back toward that doorway out of an old and careful habit built across 3 cautious years, she no longer expected, glancing back, to find it closed against her. More often than not, these days, there was simply a man standing in it instead, bareheaded as always, one hand extended, not to stop her leaving this time, but to walk out with her into whatever the ordinary, unremarkable, thoroughly wanted day happened to hold.